It's been quite a while since my last custom LEGO creation, about a year to be exact, but I'm thrilled to be back at it, and in this video, I'm building a LEGO Star Wars Clone Wars MOC inspired by the Battle of Sarrish. I also have a special edition from Clone Army Customs for this build, but we'll get into that a bit later. Now, I have to confess, I was a bit rusty when I started recording. I had the wrong camera settings on the first day and lost all of the footage. So we're starting the build process here with a base foundation using 2 layers of offset wedge plates that are going to create the perimeter. Being happy with the overall shape and size of the foundation, it's now time to start building up the edges of the rockwork to create some height and texture for the landscape. I'm really just aiming for a detailed look while keeping the building process enjoyable and straightforward. So that's really just another way of me saying that we're keeping things simple in this build. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Battle of Sarrish, like me before I Googled it, it was a brutal conflict that took place on the planet Sarrish. It's a rocky world filled with craters and plateaus located in the outer rim. The battle itself was one of the Republic's most devastating defeats, and Captain Gregor of Foxtrot actually went missing during his retreat. With our first layer complete using a mix of cheese slopes and other slope pieces, it's time to add a second layer to give us the necessary height we need for crafting some smaller craters into the landscape. And you might be wondering why I've stuck with just one color for the terrain. Well, I wanted to avoid making the terrain look too busy, which I think can happen when you mix in too many colors into a landscape. But don't worry, as we progress, I do plan to introduce some light bluish gray into the build just to add some diversity. So our terrain is shaping up nicely. You know, it's simple, but the various piece orientations I think are giving it that rocky, natural look that I was going for. And as we transition into the higher parts of the terrain, I want to create an elevated section at the front. This elevation will add some interesting detail to the MOC, which I think is much needed. And as we fill in the build, I'll also try to introduce some different pieces to break up the monotony, while also keeping the process really just as straightforward as possible. My vision is to have a raised section that blends into the middle of the terrain, and I think just off to the right of that we can build a crater, so let's keep building. Ah, the first sighting of lime green. If you follow the channel for any period of time, you know that I have a soft spot for lime green filler bricks. And since this is a smaller MOC, we don't need to hold back on the filler brick. We can fill it in as solid as a rock. Pun intended. Solid as a rock. Get it? Anyways. With this front elevated section taking some really good shape, it's time to start working on our crater. I originally planned to have multiple craters, but considering the space constraints, we're going to stick with just a single small crater here so I have room for minifigures and another rock formation that I want to build in the rear of the build. So I like the way our crater came together. The varying elevations add visual appeal and help to bring the terrain of Sarrish to life. With the build progressing, we can continue adding tiles and studs onto the surface to introduce some additional texture into the terrain and really start bringing this rocky planet surface to life. One of my favorite techniques to add texture and variety into a landscape is to create a little height variation using wedge plates that creates a subtle edge across the terrain. It's a small detail, but I think it adds a lot to the overall look and really just brings a level of diversity and just variation into the landscape that I think looks really cool. Now let's focus on filling in more of the terrain and working on the rear of the build. I'll use wedge plates to transition from that rocky base to the textured top. I also need to keep in mind the rock formation that I want to build at the front of the landscape. So as I fill in the terrain and edge the back, I'll place a few bricks around the base of that formation so we can start its construction. I do have something different in mind for the rock formation here at the front. Up until now, I've been stacking slopes to create rock work, which has worked, but it's time to break out some snot bricks and try a new approach. I did some off-camera work to produce the rocky formation you see now, and while I'm mostly satisfied with it, I could make some minor adjustments if I were being picky. However, my main focus is on having fun and getting back into the hobby, so I'll just live with what I've made. I'm actually fairly happy with it. To add some additional detail to the rock work, I did place a few inverted stalactites. Now that might not be entirely realistic without a ceiling, but creativity has no limits, and I think it adds an interesting touch. I also included a Lego boulder because I believe it adds character to the build. It's okay for Lego to look like Lego, and I like these boulder pieces and I think they fit well here. Given our limited space, it's time to tackle the rock formation at the rear. This is probably my biggest challenge in this relatively simple build since we need to build height in a tight space. So we'll need to get creative and use snot techniques where the Lego studs are oriented on their sides. That's going to allow us to use longer slopes with unique angles, and that'll kind of help bring this section of rock work higher and hopefully provide a good visual appeal and represent rock work fairly well. And there you have it. I'm genuinely pleased with how this rock work turned out. It's a pleasant surprise actually, and even the back, where I didn't use any snot or wedge slopes, that came together well and looks fairly natural. Considering the limited space and kind of this thin space that we had to work with, this is probably my favorite part of the build. I've actually learned a lot just in a few pieces on this small section when it comes to rock work that'll come in useful in future projects. I really think rock work is a continuously improving process, so each time I do it, I learn a little bit something more. Now we're on to the most exciting part of the build, and before we open our Clone Army Customs package, let's grab a few minifigures to start imagining where they're going to fit into our MOC. We're going with a few 2/12 Clone Troopers, which happen to be some of my favorite minifigures, along with a handful of Super Battle Droids. And of course, we're going to need a few of these B1 Battle Droids. Something that I like to do before I actually get into posing minifigures is I like to place them within the build to get a sense of spacing and to visualize what the potential poses might be. In the Battle of Sarrish, the Republic faced a devastating defeat, and they had to make a demoralizing retreat. So my plan is to position the Separatists on the right side of the build, densely packed to represent a larger force, and also because we're really working with a tight space here. On the left, we'll have the Republic forces retreating with their eyes fixated on a few last-minute heroics by one of their leaders on the battlefield. Which brings us to our package from Clone Army Customs. And as you might have guessed, it's the Commando Captain Gregor himself. I absolutely love the 360-degree print on this custom minifigure. Commandos are already really cool, but this camouflage print really takes it to the next level. The helmet detail and the printed commando pack are spot on. The kill count on the helmet adds a really nice touch, and I couldn't be happier with this purchase. So let's go ahead and get some weapons on these minifigures. We'll place them into the MOC and we can enjoy a brief cinematic showcasing what our completed build looks like. We'll go ahead and roll that now. So before we wrap things up, don't forget to check out some of my past builds here on the screen right now. I really appreciate you stopping by to watch my first video in quite a long time, over a year. So it's great to be building again, and I'll catch you in the next video. Happy building, and thanks again.